think like the reason why mental health has always been like a big thing in like my mind of like talking about it is just because of the fact that it isn't really talked about, at least in like my household. It was always this thing. It's like I'm not sure if like what I can open up on, because like I don't want to sound like I hate like my family. Like, you know what I mean? Like I don't want to sound like I'm living this terrible life, but like I'm it's like not that bad is like what I would be told like if I were to ever bring it up to like family. It's like be grateful like with what you have, like the life that you're living right now. Like you have so much more than say like my family in the Philippines. And it's kind of that like two-way side of like you feel like you can't talk about what you're going through because it's not as bad as what other people are going through. And I think that's kind of like the stigma that I'm trying to change with conversations about mental health. It's important not to compare yourself with like other people and like what you're going through, just because everybody's experience is different. And that's kind of like the light that I want to shine on like topics of mental health. It's like nobody has the right to tell you how you're feeling and why you're feeling that way. Like this is, you just have to come to terms with like how you are and be able to like find those people that you trust and be able to talk about them.
Thank you for sharing, Emily.
Thanks.
For me, I didn't know much about mental health until I went to college, and I barely even considered like emotions, feelings, growing up, because I was always told, to suppress them as, being the eldest male figure in the family. It was me navigating a lot of pressure from family, and I don't know why, and that really like kickstarted my journey into understanding like, why do I think this way? Does this impact like the direction that I want to go forward? And it was like a really huge eye opener, because every time I share about like mental health, people think of like, oh, like it's like not like those crazy people. And like, I hate when like that word crazy is like used to describe people who are experiencing a lot of like really heavy mental health um, challenges. And for me, it's like also that passion of social justice that's attached to mental health, which is what kind of led me to where I am now.
Ingrainment of like religion as like a Filipino as well has a lot of influence on like mental health, because like a thing that like people would often say is like bahala na, it's like leave it up to God. Or like if you would tell your like family members about something that you're going through, it's just like, oh, it's like just pray, like it'll get better, like God will help. And it's like not saying that like it's bad to like pray or like bad to like kind of rely on this like higher being, but also it's important to like have something to like be able to deal with it, like relying on this like higher being when you don't exactly know if anything will help or not.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. Like, for me, like, even though I was like raised in a predominantly like Catholic family, my journey with like Catholicism still shaky, but like it started when I started going to confirmation classes. Even then, I like realized that, prayer and like religion as a form of self-care isn't necessarily bad, but when it becomes warped in a sense of like this is the only way that you do things, and it's an either or, black or white thinking, that's when growth is stunted. And I'm not discrediting the impacts of religion on people's faiths, because of course like Filipinx have used religion as a way of resilience for hundreds and hundreds of years. And even like Emily, you named the Bahala Na, that is such a Filipino phrase, but at the same time that the core of it is lost. Like Bahala Na actually really means like having one's own sense of responsibility, this inner sense of like control in your life, with the guidance of like a higher being, not just a reliance. And that translation has been lost because of, like having been told otherwise and being indoctrinated by white Christianity. And yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, but it's just really important to name that wherever people find meaning in their lives that is important and should never be discredited, and that, there is just so many ways out there to take care of yourself, and that's okay. And to like not bash on anyone's one way of coping, because however unique a person's identity is, and the way that works for them is, important, because there's no truly one size fits all.
Absolutely. And I think when you think of religion, it is very much, it gives people like ease of mind to a certain degree, knowing that there is like something out there like helping to better yourself. And like definitely like with what I was saying, not trying to like diss like having a religion at all. But it's just also like an interesting thing to keep in mind when you are like referring to those terms and not knowing like the meaning behind it, like what you were saying. Like that's something that I've never really heard of, like that thought process of bahala na, just because like you hear it and like you just associate it with like, oh, just leave it up to God. And yeah, and like how things can get lost in translation. Talking about religion too, I actually was talking to one of my friends about like mental health in her community, and she said that her mother, the church that they go to, that they started having counseling, but like with more of like a religious point of view, just to kind of have this conversation start, of like group therapy, and like being able to like either talk to like nuns or like a priest on like one-on-one, and just have that type of counseling. And it's also interesting to see that like happening in a religious setting versus like, I guess, like a scientific kind of more of like a doctor like medical sense of it, because it is also important to realize that like mental health is also something that you experience, like that you do need to understand like the science to a certain degree to like understand like what's going on with like mental health, and being able to understand that side of it as well.
Because, for a long time, even those resources, and still those resources are unavailable. Like I live in Portland right now, and when I was trying to find a therapist, I could not find one single Asian American therapist. Um, and I was lucky enough like stumble upon one, but like you think about like access a lot, and you think about like, okay, in Hawaii, like are there like mental health resources available, and if so, how like aware is the community about it, like how aware is our community about those resources, um, and is that something that they want? So it's like a lot of like different things and a lot of intersections to think about as we kind of explore this together.
I feel like oftentimes when you hear someone going to like counseling or any type of mental health, like talking about like a bad thing, and then it's like what people would start to gossip about you, oh, like there's something wrong with them, like.
Mhm.
And like the thing is, it's like changing that like narrative around like mental health, that is like not a bad thing, and like exactly like you said, it's something that everybody goes through. It's your emotions, how you're feeling, and just having an outlet of someone that who you can talk to about this and kind of like help you navigate like what you're going through.
Going off of that too, something just kind of clicked in me, was like, I was like, oh yeah, there are different modalities. So like mental health counseling, there is that spiritual like focus, that more pastoral counseling sense, and not a lot of people know that. And I didn't know that too. And like spiritual direction, like however people, what best fits them, in terms of their style, because like when you do look for a therapist or look for a counselor, then often they will have a description of like what kind of style that they have, and that's really important to look into, because there are very direct counselors, there are very much like counselors who like to teach, and there are people who do different things. And so yeah, it's like really important to name that, uh, whenever looking for counseling, it's really important to know yourself and know like your style and what kind of helps you grow. Looking at healing not only, and like mental health and self-care, not only from a like psychological standpoint, but also like as a physical health standpoint, a social standpoint, finances, your work, um, the geography and place that you live, these are all really important and play a huge factor in how like you take care of your mental health. And it's important to address all those things because oftentimes, like we live in, not oftentimes, but we do live in a very intersectional world, but we live in our minds very fragmented and very compartmentalized. And it's truly an integration of all things in order to come to a place of greater understanding, a greater state of mental health.
I actually really like that idea. It is really so true. Like we have to look at the intersectionality of all these things because at its core, if you think about it, like mental health affects like every aspect, even like the weather. Like seasonal depression is definitely a thing. Like your levels of like sunlight that like comes in, like that's like a whole nother topic of like mental health. And yeah, just like thinking about like how a lot of it is related to each other, and it's kind of like you can't have one without the other, and like they all like affect everything. And just like even talking about, like you did mention, like when you yourself were trying to find a counselor, like trying to find like an Asian counselor. I think that's so important. It's like this idea of being able to like talk to someone who you don't need to explain yourself to. It's just that like connection of when you can just start talking about like, I don't know, like how you grew up, like what your family is like, the values that they hold, um and like having someone that can relate to that, and someone who can like help you guide you through this as like a counselor is so important. um I know that this is not on like a same level, but like in college I'm a resident assistant, and my resident director is Filipino Japanese, and he has kind of been like my mentor through like my whole college experience. And he's always fighting for diversity in like these spaces of like resident assistants, counselors, all of this. Because if you think about it, like for like a student who is either of like the same identity as like their resident assistant, they're more likely to go and talk to them about their problems, or like if they need help with something, rather than explaining it to like a white person who they probably wouldn't even talk to in the first place, just because they would think that they would have to like describe like all of these other things in order for them to just understand like the one problem that they're going through. And I think that's the thing about with like Asians and also like Filipinos, is that like idea that like a lot of the things that you do is not just for yourself, it's for your family. And having that like idea acknowledged and realized that that's a thing that just happens, and like that's what we grow up knowing and doing, and not having to explain that to someone, it just like makes the experience easier.
I really like that too, and I can definitely attest like my college experiences. I went to a predominantly white institution, and I didn't realize how hard it was in in hindsight because I assimilated and uh, that was my way of survival and that was what I knew at the time. And it's when like I started talking to people who like looked like to me or were brown or black and like sharing those stories and not like I love like not explaining yourself all the time because I've had white therapists who have had to explain everything about my culture and like was like a person of color and she was like I get it, like it's hard being an immigrant like person of color family it and like that like statement alone like just makes you feel so safe and so heard in ways that like just feel so like radically loved. And I really love that about representation and how important it is to like diversify spaces. And growing up in Hawaii, like we were in a place where it was truly the most diverse place I've ever lived. Not having that changes you so much because of that and like how it impacted my mental health. Like I realize even more how important it is to stay in touch with my culture and to learn more and to also unlearn a lot from my experiences, being around a lot of white folks and like feeling less. And that's like a whole different conversation too. Art affected in that way somehow, some way. And it's so comforting to not have to go through that alone. and to have someone say like, yes, I understand, like I'm with you. In terms of holistic healing, I think of it as like there are so many different parts of like my life that needs to be addressed and how they all intersect. Emily kind of mentioned it already, how my physical health impacts my social life, it impacts my mental health. Mental health impacts my physical um, like lifestyle, and it also impacts my social lifestyle. It can affect my finances. It can affect my relationships. It can affect my worldview and my interactions with the environment. When you think about healing holistically, I think of not just doing one thing over and over and over again and hoping you get the same results, but finding a lot of things in your like toolbox, in your like rituals and your lifestyle in order to feel the most alive. So like what that looks like personally for me is I do a lot of journaling, and for me that is a way of like physically getting my emotions out on paper, and a way for me to kind of put thoughts into so many words and like to just kind of go and be non-judgmental um, on myself. That is really impactful. In terms of physical exercise, if I'm gonna be honest, because of COVID, I haven't gotten a lot of it. But it's like nicer out here in Portland now, so I've been walking a lot, and like even like being outside and in Portland is such a great place that like sometimes I feel like I'm going crazy, but like because it's so nice and blue and like you see nature and whatnot, like that also impacts my mental health. Because I feel more happy and I feel alive and in tune with like my senses again. And because of that, like walking, coming home, I just feel like more energized because I'm moving my body. It's this sense of like body, mind, and spirit. It's like what my like I was first told about this with my like high school teacher, and it's been carried with me since about like, we are a whole unit. For those in the medical field, like you don't just talk about like your heart and not talk about your eyes, you know. It's that kind of thing too. You can't just like symptomize things. You have to see the story, and with that it's like to see your whole self.
I love that so much. I feel like I keep saying that I love what you guys are saying, but it is so genuine. It's also just like having conversations like this of like being able to like talk about these things and learn from one another, and just like I feel like with a lot of the things that I'm hearing, it's things that I have felt but I have never had words to like put them to. And like with like you were us like having this conversation, it's finally like these words is exactly what I'm feeling. But yeah, it is just like so interesting, like even thinking about like when I first like moved to college as well. Like I moved to a state that I've never been to, that I've never visited until I moved in day of. And it was in Boston, Massachusetts. And the one thing that did not like expect at all was the fact of like how much like seasonal depression was a thing, and like how the weather and how the climate actually affects you. And one of the biggest things like on the East Coast especially is like daylight savings. Like I would go to class at 4 p.m. and it'd be daylight, and by the time my class would end it would be pitch black. And I didn't realize how much that affected me, but I think it like definitely like made me want to like, it made me sleepy, like it made me not want to do anything just because it was like so dark. And I just thought like, oh, I'll just like lie in bed, and then like I would just like not talk to anybody until like my roommate would come home. And that was like the only interaction that I had. But I like learned like from that, and like learned that this is something that affects me. And like what I like try to do to like combat this is like to always like have a lot of lights on around me during that time, to like kind of instill that like, oh, it's only like 5 p.m. and it's still the day, like you still have like 5 hours left, or however like you're gonna go to sleep. And just like hanging out with people who are like good for you, who support you, who are there for you, and just surrounding yourself with good people. And I realize that's like one of the most important things like in my life is like surrounding myself with like people who like actually care about me. um but yeah, like you said, like mental health like does like incorporate like all aspects of like your life, just as like you said, like a doctor doesn't just focus on your heart. They also like look at your eyes, like they look at your whole body as you as a whole. And it's important to like take that into account with like mental health, social life, physical health, like all of this like ties in.
And I just wanted to add on to what you were saying, Emily. Like, I totally feel you for when it gets darker and you're like so tired to work and all, and it definitely affects you mentally, and it causes stress because you think you're not doing enough, and then you just overthink everything. I totally get that. And so I also wanted to share why mental health was important to me as well, since I just hopped on. I'm sorry if I totally um cut off the agenda you had, but mental health for me is important because I never realized how much I overthinked in life and how that affected the way I worked as a person and how I perceived myself as, because I'd always put doubt on myself and I wouldn't see how it's very unnecessary for me to think that. And I'm still learning along the way, learning from other people's stories. And yeah, I wanted to help others as well to focus on self love, caring for yourself, and cleansing, basically. And when it comes to talking about mental health in our families, sometimes they might not understand the topic of mental health because, well, from my experience growing up, it was more like, oh, just get over it. It's nothing. Like, just focus on your school, focus on your studies. And I'm like, Mom, this is so hard. Why don't you understand? But yeah, everything falls back to mental health and how you take care of yourself, because that shows how you're able to care for others as well.
Right. And if we can't take care of ourselves, how do we expect to take care of each other in the community and the systems that we have? And like also naming that, like bringing it back to Tiffany, what you said about like, or they don't know what that mental health is. And I think we have the privilege to even like talk about like mental health and to address that in our families, because like bringing it back to like our needs as human beings, like for so long our families, for the most part, especially those who have immigrated, have like lived for survival. And you still see that in like Hawaii, like we're also living to survival because it's so goddamn expensive. And like sometimes that just takes up so much space in our minds that we don't think about like the the whole thing, of like our emotions and whatnot. We discredit that and we sacrifice, because that's what Filipinos do, is we sacrifice. And yeah, it's, you know, continuing to bring it back into paint the bigger picture, um, and to open that door, and plant that seed. Because it's like the challenge that I've seen, especially like naming that I'm going into career into mental health, is they're like, why? And I'm like, you know, it's to paint that bigger picture and to do so in a way that they understand. And sometimes that's a challenging conversation to have, but you know, you gotta plant the seed somewhere.
I guess to bring up what Tiffany said, like bringing it to our families. I remember before this video, before we started, actually, I was watching Emily's video again on the misidentity and mental health, and then something that one of your participants said that kind of stood out, and then like once Tiffany was bringing it up, is that our families, the concept of like you have to work harder to forget your problems, something like that. That one guy that said like in order to forget our problems, you have to go to work so that you don't have to think about these things, and like that just like intertwines with so many things.
Like, heard that and I was like, wow, that is like Bible right there, Filipino Bible, because I guess like I guess it's because of like our history. our families pass, they kind of learn to work hard in order to persevere, strive for your dreams, and it's nothing to the and nothing relates back to like emotions to them, I guess, growing up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's such a great thing to like bring up too, because like Jethro, like when you were talking, I was literally thinking about like the people that I talked to in like that little video that I made as well. And there's like so many aspects of like what you were saying of like our parents were just like survival mode. Like what can we do to like just keep going? And like now we've kind of, although we are still like fighting to survive, especially in like with like higher prices of living and like all of that, we are like us, like our generation is kind of like at this like higher like privilege to be able to be talking about like mental health and like kind of examining like how this like affects us. And I think it's like such an important thing to like talk about, because although it like brings up like these ideas of like success and like the pressures that like come with like success and like being able to like make your family proud and like everything, I think like Tiffany mentioned that like in the beginning, it's like what can I do that makes my parents proud, like makes my family proud, and like makes their sacrifice like worth it, I guess. And I guess it's like trying to find like a balance between that of like doing what you think is right and like for yourself, but also still being able to like help your family and like those around you. And like I don't even have like an answer for like that, but I think it's just like a part of it like because of having like conversations like these, just being able to know that a conversation is happening is also like inspiring within itself.
Yeah, I love that. And going off of that, like something that just came up for me was like, I think at least I can only speak from my experience, but the one thing that like my parents all really want, and they always say this, is like, I just want you and your brother to take care of yourselves and like individually and each other, like when we're gone. Like I just want you to be safe, to have a house under your like the roof over your head, food to eat, and to have that. And um that's their way of showing love, and then they show love through support and through like these sacrifices to have these things now, that sometimes like even I have to remind myself that, because I do work with a lot of people who don't, and like realizing that, you know, yes, and uh we also need to follow like our passions, because like we were given so many gifts um to share and speak and to continue to represent the Filipino American community in ways that are beyond what is stereotypically um, like prescribed to us. And that's important, because you know we need representation everywhere, and we can't do that if we continue to deny like our essence of who we are and like our true interests and passions.
From me, from my personality, I honestly would just hit them straight with it because I don't know how else to do it with my parents, to be honest with you. I mean, there was a time even I was so extra, I created a slideshow to show my parents because I need them to just sit down and like listen for a second, get off Facebook, mom, just listen to some social issues for once and not think about Facebook. I don't mean to call people out or make it sound like a joke, but it's just so
I
true.
think that I agree with you. It is so hard, because even like getting past the first step of talking to them and bringing something up automatically assumes the sense of like guilt, and also this like disrespect that like, is not intentional. I'm not disrespecting you, mom and dad, or like grandma, auntie, uncle. Like I am just wanting to have a conversation with you, and sometimes like that in itself is just hard to initiate. But the way that I have like found it kind of helpful is asking questions to them, like, what, oh mom, like why do you think this way, or like, oh, so you're saying like this, like, oh, can you tell me more about like that, trying to find a way that it relates to them and impacts like something that they are. I think bringing up family is always something important, like how it affects the family, how it affects money, how it affect yeah, like money is a big thing, you know, in our culture, and it's like how it affects money, how it affects like family. Um, naming those things and finding ways to tailor that to like your parents and our culture. Um, and I don't have any concrete or practical things because that's something I'm currently trying to understand myself.
Yeah, absolutely. Like going off with what you were saying, like trying to find a way to like relate to your parents, like that's kind of like what I try to do. I definitely do start off with like how like Tiffany said, like I just like try to like cut straight, like go to it. And it does often end up with like yelling matches of like me trying to like be heard. And I'm like, you need to listen to me. But I think like what I've learned of like seeing how like because you are just like so passionate about these things and you like want your parents to like understand as well. Um, but what I like try to do is like I try to give them like hypothetical situations. Like I'm just like, well, imagine if you were like feeling like this or like this happened to you. Like how would you react? And like trying to get them to like understand that way. And I think that's like very similar to like what Jethro said is like asking them questions. Um, being able to like take what like they say and like kind of like hearing what they have to say and like trying to see like in what they answered like what can I use to help them like understand like what's kind of like going on in the world and like what's going on within.
So like difficult to bring up these conversations with parents because they weren't exposed to this type of thing as much as like we are, and as more important it's becoming to take it more seriously, I guess. Like even when I was trying to explain the whole Black Lives Matter movement to my mom, it's like hard because they think like, oh, like why should I care about this doesn't relate back to me. Like going back to like our history, it's not the same, but we have that stripping away of culture and everything. But in order for me to explain it to my mom, sometimes I kind of have to relate it back to our culture, or I'd have to say like heartbreaking stuff like, oh mom, what if he was a Filipino, would you have cared more? And it's it's just hard to have so much like passion and drive just for it to be not taken seriously or feel like you're not being heard.
And how sometimes like it's hard not to take it personally too, right? It is so hard not to take it personally because it feels like it always feels like an attack, at least for me. um but like, and those are the moments I get so frustrated, but at the same time, like after a while I start to realize, oh wait, this is beyond my parents too. It's not just my parents, it's our whole like ethnicity, like years and years and years of having to close your mouth so that you can live, or years and years and years of like having to obey like a like authority figure, and how that's been passed on through generations. Like intergenerational trauma is a huge thing, and how that affects like our family members especially, and how they interact with us is like sometimes, at least for me, it's so often overlooked because, you know, like I grew up in the United States, that's all I know. Whereas like my parents, like what they know is like two very distinct cultures that they were both like that they both grew up in, and that's a hard thing. And that's why like empathy is really important, to even like be aware of that sometimes. Has helped me at least continue fighting the good fight of having these conversations with my parents, and with like even like with like white people. Like for me, it's like I don't have the responsibility to educate like white people or anyone who doesn't look like me, um, because they have the resources to do so. And like even with like my family members, that's different because, you know, you add in like the disrespect and you add in everything, and like it's just hard as a child, and it still like feels tough. And yeah, it's as we continue to kind of journey through this all, I hope that one day like that that seed turns into a plant and then a tree, and like it starts to make sense, because like knowing that we can't fix anyone, but we can instill hope and like thought, and hope that it manifests through with time and with like continued efforts, is like something that keeps me grounded, at least.
When my voice starts shaking because it's just so emotional and it's something I'm like super passionate about. I really want there to be change in our families, in the world. And then whenever I feel like giving up because mentally it gets overwhelming, I'm always thinking, one day when I have a kid, I'm gonna teach her how to be strong, or him or her to be strong, because you know we are the change, we're the future. These are the type of conversations that need to be happening more, because I feel like in this generation we get really distracted by other things that's not socially, that's not like a social issue. It's just like we get distracted with our own selfishness and just, I don't know how to explain, but yeah. Sometimes you have to be selfish for yourself to think about and clear your head though. Like there's different ways to perceive it.
Absolutely. And like also thinking about like the ideas of mental health, I think I really only started thinking about it like maybe in college is like when it started to like hit. Um, because I would be in like college thinking about like how I was like in like middle school or just like growing up. Like I was definitely like a perfectionist. It's like everything had to be perfect. Like I always wanted like the highest grade, and like I would be like so nitpicky on myself, and just like, and like I think Tiffany, I think you mentioned this before, it's like that self-doubt of like, oh, like it needs to be like perfect. Which is like, what is perfect? Like, is anything even perfect? But like all of these, like thinking about them, like these experiences of when I was younger and thinking about them as like someone who is like older, it's just like realization of like, oh, like this was like mental health. And like this is like, it was always something that like I even catch myself like now thinking about it. It's like if I ever get into one of those like phases of like self-doubt or like I'm not good enough, I just like push it off to the side and I'm like, it's okay, like I just have to keep going. And I think like what's so important is that like that needs to shift, and like you need to stop thinking about like, oh, like it'll just pass, like I just need to like keep going through, but like actually like taking the time to like reflect on it, or like even finding someone to like talk to about it, which is like the important conversation to be like.
I started thinking about mental health when things started getting harder in college. Like I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know if I was going in the right direction. And then, but I'd always hide the fact that, you know, I'm like struggling on the inside. And for me, I thought that because I put up some kind of facade, something to hide away my emotions, because people perceived me as like, you know, the happy peppy girl. Like I didn't want anyone to see me sad, or like I didn't know what I was doing, especially because I was holding a pageant title, Miss Hawaii Filipina. I didn't want the youth to look at me like I didn't know what I was doing. But that brought back to, hey, you know, I have this title. You may see me as a queen or whatnot, but I'm still human. I'm still human. I go through the same emotions as you do, and that's when I realized I wanted to use mental health as my platform.
Talking about like mental health, so one of the things like I mentioned, like why I was interested in it is also to like help like just start this conversation and like learn more about it. And I'm actually writing my senior thesis about how a past of colonization affects the mental health of Filipino Americans. So I am currently reading Brown Skins, White Minds by Dr. E.J.R. David. Looks like Jethro has the book. It seems like he's going to go and get it. Oh my gosh. Yes, honestly, that book has been so enlightening. And I think I have like learned so much. I haven't finished it yet, but definitely like how it like breaks down the book, like just understanding like the initial history of like the Philippines before the colonizers came is such a big thing. Just because I feel like growing up Filipino, like I was always told by my mom, she was like, you're full Filipino. Like, don't say you're Filipino Spanish. Like, don't say you're Filipino Chinese. Like, just embrace that you are like full Filipino. And I think like having like my parents like support and embrace that Filipino culture of them has made me like realize to be like so proud of who we are like as a people, as a culture, and all of that. But there has been like Filipinos that I did grow up with that were like, oh, like I'm like Filipino Spanish, and it's like you're just clearly Filipino. And like it is so easy for us to say because I mean for the most part like some Filipinos have like Spanish last names. Like my last name is Cristobal and that literally means Christopher in Spanish. And like my first name's Emily, which is like a basic white girl name. Yeah.
Girl, my name is Tiffany. How much more white can that get?
Yeah, exactly. And it's like all these things, it's like through our names. If anybody like saw our name, they wouldn't like, I don't know if they would think that we are like a Filipino person, just by like our first names or our full names. Being able to look at how like powerful like the indigenous like Filipino people were, or like trying to get more Filipinos to like understand and like embrace their Filipino culture and to be proud of like where they come from and like all the people that have come before them. But that's just like the little bits of my research.
I really loved what you said. Like, it was very informational, and I still have a lot of research to do. And you really put that long story in like short. So I'm really glad I got to learn a little from you as well. I can definitely relate to Filipinos having high expectations and this mentality of success, which also leads to having these mental health issues because you want to make your family proud, you want to represent them, you want to represent your last name, the Philippines, where you come from, your background. But sometimes you have to realize that this is also, you're doing this also for yourself, and that you want to make sure what you're doing is something that you love. And I feel like that's how like mental health plays an important role on what we're doing. And I love what you were talking about in the history, because I also used to like, I wasn't really taught to be proud of my culture when I at a younger age, because my family like immigrated here and they were put in that mindset to fit in, have the American dream. And it's kind of crazy because even from a Filipino, or like from the Philippines, you kind of like look at us who immigrated here as like very successful, have a lot of money, and it's sometimes that's just not it. Like, we still struggle here as well with our identities. And I think that's where the youth and having discussions like this comes to place, to reclaim that, to learn more about it and teach the younger generations. Like, just recently I realized how important it is to remember your roots, and um, remember like the adversities Filipino face. And you can see that today in this culture, or in different cultures as well, like, you know, the whole Black Lives Matter movement and Juneteenth. But it's kind of, we're not the same, like we're not the same. Black and Filipinos are definitely not the same, our history, but we we just have similar aspects, I guess. I don't really know how to explain it, but the history is there for us Filipinos.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with all of that has been said. Like, um, even like the model minority myth pits like minorities against each other, and like even like what is minority and who was that like uh who was that like term referred to by, and was all like predominantly like European descent. And we are not the minority in America. Like even like within the Filipinx American community, like we are probably one of the like most growth like highest populations of like Asian Americans here, and like yet there's just so much that in that gets kind of confused too. It's like even within the Asian American culture, sometimes like being Filipinx isn't the same as being like Japanese, Korean, Chinese, and like not a lot of people see that because like Emily mentioned, we were colonized by Spain and the United States, and um, our values, though similar to some other countries, our experience is also so unique because, and like also living in Hawaii too, like living on land that was stolen from us, and from the native Hawaiians, and you know, it's just so like it's just so sad to see that like sometimes like Asian Americans and Filipino American communities in particular just see themselves as just like not in solidarity with, you know, like Black and brown communities, saying that, oh no, we're better, like, oh, we don't see we don't experience the things we did. I'm like, no, like look at your history. There's just so much, and like Filipinos at one point were just banned from the United States, and like no one knows that, you know. So it's just like, and that was all because like colonial mentality and like this false understanding of what the American dream is, and how that's still perpetuated through education in the Philippines especially, and even like in Hawaii too. And it's like also naming that, like bringing it back to mental health, how, you know, mental health, though it's important to take care of ourselves and challenge these mindsets and these like thoughts and behaviors, it's also important to address it in like like the education system, like in policy, in like resources and whatnot. So yeah, it all intertwines and it all intersects in those ways.
Well, I can definitely relate to Filipinos having high expectations and this mentality of success, which also leads to having these mental health issues because you want to make your family proud, you want to represent them, you want to represent your last name, the Philippines, where you come from, your background. But sometimes you have to realize that you're doing this also for yourself, and that you want to make sure what you're doing is something that you love. And I feel like that's how like mental health plays an important role on what we're doing. And I love what you were talking about in the history, because I also used to like, I wasn't really taught to be proud of my culture when I at a younger age, because my family like immigrated here and they were put in that mindset to fit in, have the American dream. And it's kind of crazy because even from a Filipino, or like from the Philippines, you kind of like look at us who immigrated here as like very successful, have a lot of money, and it's sometimes that's just not it. Like we still struggle here as well with our identities. And I think that's where the youth and having discussions like this comes to place, to reclaim that, to learn more about it and teach the younger generations. Like just recently I realized how important it is to remember your roots, and um remember like the adversities Filipino face. And you can see that today in this culture or in different cultures as well, like, you know, the whole Black Lives Matter movement and Juneteenth. But it's kind of, we're not the same, like we're not the same. Black and Filipinos are definitely not the same, our history, but we we just have similar aspects. History is there for us Filipinos.
Just a little bit about like how you kind of mentioned it's like, oh yeah, it's like we kind of do have like a similar experience in a way, but definitely not the same. But yeah, like in the book Brown Skins White Minds, he does compare like how Filipinos did in a way experience like the same like type of injustices as like Native Americans, Native Indians, as and African Americans during that like time period. Just because if you also look at the Philippines, they were one of the only Asian countries that were colonized by America. So I think that like does play a lot into like the similarities of their experiences. It really is just very, it's, I don't know what the word is. I'm trying to think of it. I don't know, intersectional? I don't know. But I think like for Filipinos too, like realizing, like especially with like the Black Lives Matter movement and all of that, it's like that idea of like the model minority, like we need to realize too that like we experience very similar things to like what they experience, and like we need to like use our voices and our platforms to also like keep fighting that fight with them.
No, I definitely agree with all of that has been said. Like, um, even like the model minority myth pits like minorities against each other, and like even like what is minority and who was that like uh who was that like term referred to by, and was all like predominantly like European descent. And we are not the minority in America. Like even like within the Filipinx American community, like we are probably one of the like most growth like highest populations of like Asian Americans here. And like yet there's just so much that in that gets kind of confused too. It's like even within the Asian American culture, sometimes like being Filipinx isn't the same as being like Japanese, Korean, Chinese, and like not a lot of people see that. Because like Emily mentioned, we were colonized by Spain and the United States, and um, our values, though similar to some other countries, our experience is also so unique because, and like also living in Hawaii too, like living on land that was stolen from us, and from the native Hawaiians. And it's just so like it's just so sad to see that like sometimes like Asian Americans and Filipino American communities in particular just see themselves as just like not in solidarity with like Black and brown communities, saying that, oh no, we're better, like, oh, we don't see we don't experience the things we did. I'm like, no, like look at your history. There's just so much. And like Filipinos at one point were just banned from the United States, and like no one knows that, you know so it's just like, and that was all because like colonial mentality and like this false understanding of what the American dream is, and how that's still perpetuated through education in the Philippines especially, and even like in Hawaii too. And it's like also naming that, like bringing it back to mental health, how mental health, though it's important to take care of ourselves and challenge these mindsets and these like thoughts and behaviors, it's also important to address it in like like the education system, like in policy, in like resources and whatnot. So yeah, it all intertwines and it all intersects in those ways.
What you were saying about, I love how you rounded it back up to mental health, because it really is on our part as well to teach our families, bring the conversations in our household, even with I don't know if this goes off topic, but even when it comes to talking about mental health in our families, sometimes they might not understand the topic of mental health because, well, from my experience growing up, it was more like, oh, just get over it. It's nothing. Like, just focus on your school, focus on your studies. And I'm like, Mom, this is so hard. Why don't you understand? But yeah, everything falls back to mental health and how you take care of yourself, because that shows how you're able to care for others as well.
One of the biggest takeaways that like from having this conversation is to like take into account that like mental health is like at like the core of like a lot of the things that we like go through. Like it does affect like almost every aspect of our life, if not every aspect. um and just like taking into account to be able to have like time for like self-reflection and for like self-care, and just being able to like realize like the strengths in our community and not only focusing on like these like stereotypes of like really similar to like what Tiffany said. It's like that we are kind of like, you know, the laborers and like all of that. Like we are so much more. And like once people start to like hear our voices and hear our experiences, hopefully it will like inspire like this like next generation and even like our generation of Filipinos to keep on striving, to reach that like success, and like success as to like whatever they themselves define it as, and not just like the success that is kind of like outlined for them.
Something that I'm taking away is, you know, to be open and to be like okay with having these kinds of conversations, because like I was a bit nervous going into this, not knowing what to expect. And like, though we all have like our passion about mental health, like even having that conversation can be really difficult. And so, and like for me personally, like identifying more as an introvert, like I love to acquire knowledge, but like not share it. And like having the confidence to share that information and to share my stories and um, to share them in solidarity with other stories and be surprised to see how much we relate than like negate. And so I want to be able to be more confident in like myself to have these conversations and like trusting my own inner authority and trusting that, you know, like my experiences are valid. I don't have to explain it, but um knowing that like sharing parts of me and being vulnerable will ultimately lead to the growth of our larger community.
I think like just having these conversations like just goes to show like we like don't know each other. Like, you know what I mean? And like the fact that we like don't even know each other but we're able to like relate on so many aspects like just goes to show like how awesome like this is, and like the things that like connect us together, like whether that be being like being Filipino and also just like passionate about mental health. That's just like super awesome just to see that like how much people can connect when you just have a conversation.
Thank you guys. Like I'm so thankful to have had this conversation with you and to have met you guys virtually. I mean, I'd love to meet you guys in person as well, because sometimes it may be hard for some people to find people to connect to in order to have these conversations. But the fact that, like what you said, we did not even know each other shows that there are people out there who care and who respects and listens to what you have to say.
Despite like not knowing each other beforehand, like how rooted we are in like these shared experiences and the shared identity. And I think that's a beautiful thing that I hope to continue to see unfold in our like generation and our like overall like Filipinx community going forward. So excited for what's to come. And also like Tiffany, I'll be at Manoa next starting in the fall. So like if you want to talk more about and have these conversations, and like Chachi too, and like of course Emily, but like it's also so great to be able to have these conversations and whatnot. So yeah.